What if everything you thought you knew about one of history's most feared figures was built on centuries of deliberate erasure? What if the name Lucifer, whispered in terror across countless generations, originally belonged not to a fallen demon, but to an African deity whose light was systematically extinguished from religious memory? Deep beneath the Vatican archives, scholars have uncovered fragments of ancient texts that tell a startling story. These weathered papyri, written in Coptic and Ge'ez scripts, speak of a luminous being whose worship once stretched from the temples of Kush to the monasteries of early Christian Ethiopia. His name appears in pre-Islamic inscriptions carved into the sandstone cliffs of Nubia, where pilgrims once journeyed to witness his glory. Yet somehow, this radiant figure vanished from official religious doctrine, replaced by the dark mythology we know today. The trail begins in ancient Kush, modern-day Sudan, around 300 BCE. Archaeological excavations at Meroe have revealed temple inscriptions dedicated to Asar-Luci, the bringer of dawn. Kushite priests described him as the herald of spiritual awakening, the one who carried divine fire to humanity. His symbol, a golden serpent crowned with light, adorned the burial chambers of Nubian royalty. These weren't demons or fallen angels. These were gods of illumination, wisdom, and transformation. Dr. Aida Bashai's groundbreaking 1987 excavation at Qasr Ibrim uncovered a collection of Christian Nubian manuscripts dating to the 8th century CE. Among them was a gospel fragment that scholars initially dismissed as heretical. The text described Lucifer not as Satan's lieutenant, but as the morning star who guides the faithful through darkness. The manuscript bore the seal of Bishop Mercurius of Dongola, a respected church father whose other writings align perfectly with Orthodox Christian doctrine. Why would such a figure preserve a text about Lucifer as a benevolent being? The answer lies in the complex religious landscape of early Christian Africa. When Christianity first took root in the kingdom of Aksum around 330 CE, it didn't simply replace existing beliefs. Instead, it absorbed and transformed them. Ethiopian Orthodox texts from the 4th century, preserved in the monastery libraries of Debre Libanos, contain prayers addressing Lucifer as an intercessor, a being who carries human supplications to the throne of the Almighty. These prayers weren't considered heretical. They were part of mainstream Ethiopian Christian practice for over 4 centuries. Islamic scholars of medieval Spain and North Africa provide another crucial piece of this puzzle. The 11th century historian al-Biruni documented his travels through the Sahel region, where he encountered Tuareg communities who spoke of Lucifer, a jinn of the dawn who protected caravans crossing the desert. Al-Biruni noted that these weren't stories of evil spirits, but of benevolent guides who led travelers safely through the darkness. When Christian missionaries arrived centuries later, they found these same communities readily accepting stories of Lucifer as the morning star, seeing no contradiction with their existing beliefs. But something changed dramatically during the 12th century. As European crusaders returned from the Holy Land, they brought with them a hardened theological perspective that left little room for such nuanced spiritual figures. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 marked a turning point. Church authorities began systematically reviewing and purging texts that didn't align with increasingly rigid doctrinal standards. African Christian communities found themselves under pressure to abandon centuries-old traditions that European clerics now deemed suspect. The transformation accelerated during the era of European colonial expansion. Portuguese missionaries arriving in Ethiopia during the 16th century were horrified to discover Orthodox Christians venerating Lucifer in their liturgy. Father Francisco Alvarez, chronicler of the Portuguese embassy to Ethiopia, wrote scathingly of the heretical practices of these African Christians who pray to demons. What Alvarez failed to understand was that these weren't demons at all, but the surviving remnants of an ancient African theological tradition that predated European Christianity by centuries. Archaeological evidence from the abandoned monastery of Debre Libanos revealed the systematic destruction of these traditions. Layers of ash and debris from the late 1500s contain fragments of illuminated manuscripts depicting Lucifer with distinctly African features, crowned with solar rays and surrounded by protective serpents. These weren't European artistic influences corrupted by local imagination. They were authentic representations of an indigenous African spiritual tradition that had evolved alongside, not in opposition to, early Christianity. The most compelling evidence comes from an unexpected source, the Ethiopian Book of Enoch. This ancient text, preserved in Ge'ez and largely unknown to European Christianity until the 18th century, contains passages describing Lucifer's role in cosmic history that differ dramatically from later Christian interpretations. Here, Lucifer appears as Azazel's opponent, the one who refuses to teach humanity the destructive arts of warfare, and instead offers the gifts of agriculture, astronomy, and healing. Ethiopian monks preserved this text for over a millennium, suggesting they saw no contradiction between honoring Lucifer as a bearer of divine wisdom and maintaining their Christian faith. DNA analysis of ancient remains from Christian burial sites in Nubia has revealed another startling fact. These communities maintained extensive trade and cultural connections with Jewish communities in Egypt and Ethiopia, connections that persisted well into the Islamic period. This cultural exchange helps explain the theological sophistication found in African Christian texts dealing with angelic hierarchies and the nature of divine light. These weren't primitive misunderstandings of Christian doctrine, but evolved theological positions developed through centuries of interfaith dialogue and spiritual exploration. The final erasure came with European colonial administration of African territories. British and French colonial officials, working closely with European missionary societies, systematically cataloged and often destroyed indigenous religious texts that didn't conform to accepted Christian orthodoxy. Colonial archives contain inventories of thousands of manuscripts removed from Ethiopian and Sudanese monasteries during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Many of these texts were never properly studied before disappearing into private collections or being destroyed outright. Today, scattered fragments of this erased tradition survive in unexpected places. Coptic communities in Egypt still preserve prayers that reference Lucifer in contexts that would surprise most Western Christians. Ethiopian Orthodox churches continue to use liturgical language that distinguishes between Satan as the adversary and Lucifer as the morning star, maintaining theological subtleties that European Christianity abandoned centuries ago. Among the Dogon people of Mali, oral traditions speak of the star teacher who brought cosmic wisdom to humanity, descriptions that eerily parallel ancient Kushite hymns to Asar-Luci. The implications of this hidden history extend far beyond academic curiosity. If Lucifer's original identity as an African deity of enlightenment was systematically erased and replaced by European concepts of demonic evil, what other aspects of African spiritual wisdom have been lost to historical amnesia? How many other indigenous traditions were rebranded as heretical or demonic to justify their suppression? Recent discoveries in the Ethiopian highlands suggest we've only begun to scratch the surface of this forgotten legacy. Archaeologists working near the ancient city of Aksum have uncovered burial chambers containing artifacts that blend Christian, Islamic, and traditional African religious symbols in ways that challenge conventional understanding of how these traditions interacted. Among these artifacts are golden amulets bearing inscriptions to Lucifer, the Lightbringer, in scripts that date to the 6th century CE, centuries before European contact. What we're witnessing is the gradual resurrection of a deliberately buried history, one that reveals the African origins of spiritual concepts that have shaped human consciousness for millennia. The story of Lucifer's transformation from African lightbringer to European fallen angel represents just one thread in a vast tapestry of suppressed knowledge, one that connects ancient Nubian temples to medieval Ethiopian monasteries to the oral traditions of Sahara nomads. As archaeologists continue to uncover
evidence of Africa's profound influence on world religious thought, we must ask ourselves what other truths have been systematically erased from official histories? What other gods have been recast as demons? What other wisdom traditions have been labeled as primitive superstition to justify their destruction? The morning star still rises over the ancient temples of Meroe, casting the same light that once illuminated the faces of Kushite priests as they chanted hymns to Asar-Luci. But now we can finally begin to see that light for what it truly was. Not the glow of a fallen angel, but the radiance of an African god whose luminous legacy was deliberately obscured, but never entirely extinguished. If this journey through forgotten history has left you questioning what other truths lie buried beneath conventional narratives, you're not alone. Here at History Off the Map, we're committed to uncovering the suppressed stories and lost civilizations that shaped our world in ways most of us never imagined. Subscribe to join us as we continue exploring the hidden connections between ancient Africa and the foundations of human spirituality. Because the more we dig, the more we discover that history's greatest mysteries often lead us back to the very continent where humanity itself first awakened to consciousness.